How do you turn it on? Oh, okay, all right, thank you. Welcome to our class. Dr. Hilliard has suggested that I take one more month and try to get closer to finishing up the book of Acts. So I'll be with you for the rest of February at least, and we'll try to get close at least to the major points at the end of Acts. It's a great book and a lot of very interesting and crucial facts in it that all of us need to know if we can. We have finished the second missionary journey, and after Paul sort of finished at Corinth, he went back around through, stopped at Ephesus briefly, and they wanted him to stay. He wouldn't, but he told them he would be back. So he went on to Antioch, made his report, started back, has come back to Ephesus, John, and whom he rebaptized, laid hands upon them, and they received the miraculous gifts that Paul and the other apostles normally give new converts by the laying on of hands. And then we come to to verse 21, and I might make note here that somewhere right around here is where Paul wrote the epistle of 1 Corinthians. He has been to Corinth. He's now come back to Ephesus, spending some time there, and he writes back to the Corinthians. And then there are some riots that take place. We just got started on that last week, and some other questions arose, and we spent time on that and didn't finish the riot. So we'll come back to that's Acts 19, beginning with verse 21. Our Brother David Phillips is going to lead our prayer this morning.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful it's the Lord's day, and that we're able to meet here this morning to assemble ourselves for a period of study. Thankful for our knowledgeable teacher. We're thankful for his years of experience in teaching. Help us to have open minds and open hearts, and to see what happened in the first century, to see how our New Testament came together, and that we can follow his pattern and example and use it in our lives today. We're also mindful, Father, of those who are regularly with us here but are sick, those that are unable to be with us. We pray that they would be able to be back with us soon. We're thankful for all the blessings that you give to us. We're especially thankful for the opportunity to worship you in the next hour. Pray that you'd be with us throughout this day and the remainder of our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So Paul, being at Ephesus, had already decided that he wanted to go to Rome and was planning to do so, leaving from Ephesus at this point to accomplish that. So verse 21 says, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia, and that would be both Macedonia, where Philippi, Berea, and Thessalonica are, and Achaia, where Athens and Corinth are. So he was planning to go back through there and then to catch a boat and go to Rome, which was sort of the capital of the world. Paul was not especially interested in going to Rome to start a church there because he knew there was a congregation there. Shortly we'll see that he writes a letter to it. And his interest, of course, is starting churches where there are none. But he also knew that that was a major place in the world of his day, and that he needed to have some influence there. And he had told them in his letter to Rome that he hoped that they would help him get on to Spain by some kind of monetary contribution to allow him to go to the furthermost parts of the earth, as far as people of that day, for the most part, knew. That was still his aim. But he sent into Macedonia two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, while he stayed in Asia, in Ephesus, for a while. And about that time, this is verse 23, there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. We started off on this, I believe, last Sunday, and the problem is that there was at Ephesus a temple of Artemis, is the Greek term for the Diana is the corresponding Roman term for her, although they're not exactly the same. They use those names. And there was a temple that had been built at Ephesus, and it was built to house a statue of Artemis, that legend had descended from heaven. So they built a temple to surround it. The temple was a magnificent structure. When you name the seven wonders of the ancient world, that temple of Artemis is one of the ones that's named among it. It was a huge and magnificent architectural wonder, and it was a center point of what Ephesus was known for. There were silversmiths there. We read about a man by the name of Demetrius, who was a leader in that trade. And one of the things they did was to make replicas of this statue of Diana and sell them. And as Paul and his companions began to preach that there was but one true God, and Artemis or Diana was not a goddess at all, the sales began to fall off. And that is a matter of great concern, of course, to the silversmiths. So they stir up some people and get a riot started against Paul. It would be sort of against the Jews and Christians both. They would not make a great distinction of that as far as those who were opposed to Artemis and didn't believe that she was a goddess. And they brought the workmen together in verse 25. And verse 26, they charge, you see and hear, that not only in Ephesus, but almost all of Asia, Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger that not only this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. They obviously wanted to make the issue more than their money. And they talked about, therefore, the significance of the worship of Diana or Artemis and the temple that was there to the people. And then they begin to cry out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. My memory says that King James may say great is Diana of the Ephesians, but that just reflects the fact that they're two different names for the same God. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Over and over again they said that. The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. And when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, that's a term for some of the officials there, whom Paul had obviously made friends with, and maybe some of them had been converted, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. But some cried out one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. That's fairly typical of riots. Excuse me. That's fairly typical of riots. You get people all stirred up, and then people come and don't even know why they're there. They just join the uproar and the disturbance. And that's what was taking place there. And they went into to a theater. But verse 33 mentions that it was the assembly that was in confusion. I want to pause for a minute about that. Not only here in verse 32, but the same gathering down in verse 39 is called an assembly, and the reference there is this is not a regular assembly. They've come together in a riot. The statement there is we need to have a regular assembly to discuss that. A regular assembly would be the official gathering of the town people to make decisions. And then later in the verse 41, it says he dismissed the assembly. That word in Greek is ekklesia, and that's the word that elsewhere in the New Testament is translated church. A church was not a very good English choice for ecclesia. We always say that the church is not a building. We understand that biblically, but the word church comes from the Scottish kirk, which has been a church building, and it was said not the best choice, although it's the one we have to live with now because it's already well settled. The etymology, as has often been stated, is called out, and that's understandable because when you have an assembly, that's a group of people who are called out to make an assembly. But usage is what determines meaning, and the meaning, basically, of ecclesia is not just called out, but it's assembly. And I think that's an important thing to understand, to see all the places where the term church is used, particularly in 1 Corinthians 14, where tongue speakers are told not to keep silent in the church. Women are told to keep silent in the church. The literal meaning there is in the assembly. What's taking place on Sunday morning in a little while from now is our assembly, our coming together as a whole church to partake of the Lord's Supper, or for whatever reason, when the whole church comes together, that is the assembly that the Bible speaks of. And there is a New Testament doctrine of assembly, if you please. And we're commanded not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is. That has to do with these occasions where the whole church comes together. And there's things to be done then and things not to be done then. That's another study and another issue, but that's clear to be taught throughout Scripture. The word ecclesia in common usage in literature outside the Bible was used as assembly just like this is. And when you have a gathering together, even if it's an unauthorized group, and especially when they talk about the occasion where the town comes together to make decisions, that's the assembly. And that's the term that Jesus chose when he said, I'm going to build my assembly. And I have often made the point that, interestingly, we are God's assembly even when we're not assembled. And one of the passages, several do, and one of the passages that makes that clear, we've already seen, may have commented on it at that time, the Apostle Paul, who was then Saul, and in breathing out threatening and slaughter, went into every house and captured men and women and brought them to the Sanhedrin for punishment and sometimes even for death. And in doing so, he was making havoc of the assembly, of the ecclesia, of the church. So going from house to house and gathering up, he was still working on the church. That's significant for a lot of reasons. Some people think that the only thing the church does is what it does when it's assembled or when it's out of its treasure. But if I ask 7 different people here, because they are members of the church, because they're Christians, to help me do some work that's good work that I want to do, then it's appropriate to say that the church did that because 4 or 5 different members doing it together makes up the church accomplishing that. There's a whole group of people, you may know about it, and it's not time to really discuss it at length, who make a very strong distinction between what the church does and what individuals do. One of the passages they use is the passage in Timothy that says if you have a believing husband, if you have a believing mother or grandmother who needs help and has to be supported, then you should do it yourself and not let the church be troubled. So there's a distinction, they said, between individuals and the church, and that's correct. But on the other hand, if I were to be in that situation, and my mother, for example, needed help, and I decided I didn't want to do it all myself, or maybe couldn't do it all myself, and I began to go around to about 8 or 10 different members that I knew and ask them to help me take care of my mother, and they contributed to that, that's still the church doing that. That's not individual action. That's still church action. What Christians do, because they're Christians, is the church acting. The church is made up of people. It's not the building. It's not just the assembly, but it's wherever we are a part of the church. And we are to do good works. And we're to do good works not only for members of the church, but for others. And that includes everybody. And when we work together to do that, then that's the church doing that. That's a very short essay on something that needs a not longer discussion. But maybe some of you at least have some knowledge of that and know where we're going with that. Yes.
Question. You made reference to Hebrews 10:25 on that not forsaking the assembly. A lot of times we take the conclusion that's referring to the assembly on the first day, but is that referring to not forsaking the assembly when the church all comes together any time that it's called together, or is that just the first day of the week?
Well, the term assembly is used in 1 Corinthians, where it's mostly defined, is when the whole church comes together in one place. Normally, that's done on Sunday morning for the Lord's Supper. But we certainly know that it's possible to have assemblies like that. In addition to that, it would be a matter of conjecture, I guess, as to whether that passage applies to that as well. But it seems to me to apply to any assembly, which is when everybody gets together at once. That's what we have on Sunday morning. We also do that on Sunday night. That's our custom. I don't know that the New Testament church did that. It seemed the New Testament church met starting late in the day and all night. It was one of their characteristics. But nevertheless, there's certainly nothing wrong with having assemblies both morning and night, and we could have them other times as well. I would assume that that's talking about whenever there is an assembly of the church.
So you're saying then that if the church is called together on Sunday night or Wednesday night, you could not say that Hebrews 10:25 does not apply to those occasions as well?
I couldn't prove that it is, but I wouldn't want to say that it isn't, if that makes any good. Okay. All right. So that's the definition of the church, and I think, Brother, many of you have heard me say that the book, The Church of Christ, an Ecclesiology for Today, written by Brother Everett Ferguson from Abilene, is one of the finest books, I'd say the finest book on the church ever written except for the Bible, and certainly one of the finest books written by any of our brethren in recent years. And one of the sentences that he made about that, in pointing out that the word church actually means assembly, is that the one thing the church can't quit doing and still being the church is quit assembly, because that by definition is its name. And it makes, obviously, the assembly of the church a very important thing, because it's the essence of what it is and then what Jesus decided to call it. There are figures in the New Testament that you're aware of. One of them's in Ephesians and one of them's in 1 Peter, where the church is compared to a building, not a literal building of brick and mortar, but where individual Christians are described as being living stones built up into a temple for God to dwell in. And that's a figure talking about as we assemble together, and we have been added to the Lord to the church by the Lord when we're saved. He continues to do that. But when he said, I will build my church, what he meant is I'll be saving people and adding them to that assembly. And he's still building his church. Peter says every time somebody is converted, that's a new living stone put into the temple of God for God to dwell in. And he builds his church by converting people. We plant, God Apollos waters, but God gives the increase. And as he gives the increase, he's still building his church. That's what he promised to do, and it is called his assembly. And that's some of the facts of etymology that I find at least interesting, and you may as well. The end result here is that the people in this riot who didn't know what was going on, nevertheless were being led by some people who wanted to punish the Christians and the Jews for being against this great temple and this goddess whom they believed the image of had fallen down from heaven. And a man of some common sense, Gaius, am I remembering right? Now let's see. The town clerk, he's called, quieted the crowd and said he was on the side of Artemis, he was on the side of the goddess, but he just talked about how great she is and how well known she is all over the world, and a few people here talking about it's not going to have any great effect, so don't worry about that, just go home and act like civilized people is basically what he was telling them to do, and they agreed to do that. But Paul had been cautioned not to go in, and that was probably a good advice for him. And at any rate, the assembly was dismissed, and the work did continue. Chapter 20 and verse 1, after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraged them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. So he leaves Ephesus and heads on up to Macedonia, which is Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, at least for the churches that we know of that he had established there. When he'd gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, and by the way, it's while he was in Macedonia at this point that he wrote 2 Corinthians. Now, the evidence for that is not in Acts, but it's in the epistles themselves. But you put together what he says about his travels and compare it to Acts, and it is obvious that it is in this visit to Macedonia that he writes 2 Corinthians. And then when he had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece, and that's the word for Achaia, down into Athens and Corinth. And there he spent 3 months. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Now, there's something going on here that the epistles talk about a great deal and that Acts only barely mentions. But the bare mention of it does validate what Paul says in the epistles about it. In the epistles that he wrote, that we have already seen, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. He wrote Romans while he was at Corinth on that occasion. He mentions in all those epistles a great deal about a collection that he is making for the poor saints in Jerusalem. In 1 Corinthians, remember in chapter 16, he tells them, just like I gave orders to the churches of Galatia, you be gathering together a contribution for the saints in Jerusalem so that I won't have to make up a contribution when I come. And do that on the first day of the week. The obvious reason for doing it on the first day of the week, because that's the day they were gathered together anyway. And so that was his commandment. Then in 2 Corinthians, chapters 8 and 9 talk about that same collection, urge them to be generous, and uses the churches in Macedonia, where he's writing from, as evidence of how they can be generous. The churches of Macedonia, he said, gave to their power, yea, and beyond their power. They gave as much as they were able and then more than they were able. I've raised the question before, how do you give more than you're able to give? Well, they first gave themselves to the Lord, is Paul's answer to that. But anyway, he's talking about that same contribution and urging the Corinthians to be generous with their contribution and have a good one for him to pick up in order for him to take it back to Jerusalem. He had two major points in that. One obviously was that the poor in Jerusalem needed help. But the more important one in Paul's mind was that he wanted to cement the unity between the Gentile churches that he had established and the Jerusalem base of the church back in Jerusalem, where things had begun. And he felt like this would contribute greatly to that kind of unity. Undoubtedly it did. It didn't help the unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem to feel any better about it, we learned later. But presumably, at least, the Christians in Jerusalem were blessed and benefited and did feel some affinity with the the Gentile churches who had contributed that. And the only mention specifically of the contribution in the book of Acts is after he gets back to Jerusalem and has been arrested and is appealed to Caesar and is being tried by the Roman governors. When he's being tried by Felix, he mentions the fact that he had come back to bring alms to the people. That would be to bring this contribution that he had gathered. Felix said, well, if he can do that, maybe he's got enough money to pay a bribe to get him out, and so he kept him a little longer. But that one mention, that Paul came back to bring alms to the people, is the only specific mention in Acts of the contribution. But it plays a very significant part in the epistles that Paul wrote during that time, so we know it was very much on his mind during the time that he was doing that. And then one of the things that he said about this collection was that it's important to provide for things honest in the sight of all men. And what he meant by that, it's important to conduct business affairs in such a way that nobody could possibly doubt that everything was being carried out on the up and up. And that's a principle that I think is very important for churches. It's one that we pay a great deal of attention to here. we have Willie Teal is our treasurer, and he is a certified public accountant. Before him was Scott, and he had dealt with those kinds of things a great deal as well. And they have set it up in such a way that all of the careful ways of being sure that everything's done on the up and up is done. Among other things, one group counts the contribution, another group puts it in the bank, and still another group is responsible for spending it. When you have a situation as you have in some churches where the same person counts the contribution, puts it in the bank, and spends it, that you can hope they're honest, and undoubtedly most of the time they are, but that's a wide open way to have a conflict of interest and invite bad things to happen. And although we don't like to think of those kinds of things happening in churches, I know specific instances where that kind of thing was being done, and the person misused a great deal of money, and in one case absconded with a great deal of the money. So I'm just saying we're very careful about that here because we've had good advice from the people who helped set it up. But what he's saying is conduct your business affairs in such a way that nobody could possibly think that somebody's doing something wrong. Too many checks and balances to enable that kind of thing to happen. What Paul did specifically to provide for things honest in the sight of all men, he mentions in the epistles, is that every church that gave money appointed messengers, and by the way, the word translated messengers there is apostles. We mentioned the fact you could be an apostle of Christ, but you can also be an apostle of a church. They're called messengers. Every church that was contributing appointed messengers to go with Paul, and Paul didn't carry all this money in his own person and be responsible for it. People from every church that contributed to it were going along with him, and that would ensure that it got used for the way that it was intended to be used. And that touches the book of Acts here, because what we find in the next few verses, in verses 4 down through 6, is that he had a group of people with him. He had Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus from Berea, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and the Asians, that would be from Ephesus, Tychicus and Trophimus, and these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. So these people that are mentioned here, putting together what we know from the epistles, are obviously the messengers that those churches selected to carry this contribution back to Jerusalem. So nobody would have any doubt that what was done with it was what was supposed to be done with it, because their own people went with them and saw to that and helped to accomplish that. So it's not surprising then that when we get back on this journey, he's now been from Ephesus up through this area, back down to here, and now he's on his way back, and then he gets here, and again, the writer begins to say us. He had left Luke last time in Philippi. He had just been through Philippi, and now at Troas, he says us, indicating that Luke is back with them at this time. And Luke continues to accompany Paul all the way back to Jerusalem, and then, although he's not in prison with Paul in Caesarea, when Paul does go to Rome as a prisoner, the we passages take up again, and Luke goes with him to that point. So the us tells us where Luke came into the situation. And they sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. That would be about the time of the Passover. And in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Remember when they saw a vision come over into Macedonia and help us, they had a straight path to Philippi, or actually to Macedonia, and then on to Philippi, and got there in just a day or so. But going back, it took 5 days to make that same trip, because when the winds were against you, you had to, as we say, to tack. You couldn't, the winds wouldn't blow you straight, the wind would blow the way they were blowing. And to get somewhere, you went this way a little bit, and that way a little bit, and this way a little bit, and all the time going the way you wanted to go a little bit. and that takes longer. And so it took them longer to get back than it took them to get there, when I would suggest the providence of God was working with them to get them to Macedonia to help the man that needed to receive the gospel. It turned out not to be a man, turned out to be Lydia and her household, and then later others. So we sailed away, and in a few days we came to Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. And on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked to them. That, of course, is a significant verse, one we make use of to point out the connection between the first day of the week, or the Lord's Day, with the Lord's Supper. And the breaking of bread is undoubtedly the breaking of the Lord's Supper. Breaking of bread is a common expression for eating. And sometimes, even in the Bible, it's used just for a common meal. But there are times when it very definitely seems to be used for the Lord's Supper. And this is one of those occasions. Later on in this epistle, we find that Paul's in a hurry. I don't mean in this epistle, in the book of Acts, in this chapter. We find out that Paul's in a hurry. He wanted to talk to the elders at Ephesus, but he didn't have time. He wanted to get back to Jerusalem by Pentecost. And so he didn't have time to go into Ephesus to talk to them. So he called them to come out to Miletus, the seacoast town, and then stopped and visited with them briefly while he passed through. That shows he was in a hurry, but at the same time, even though he was in a hurry, he waited 7 days in Troas. It took them 5 days to get across. They no doubt didn't have any idea how long it was going to take them when they started, but when they got there, it was just after the first day of the week. He wanted to visit with the saints at Troas, and he knew his first opportunity would be when they came together on the first day of the week. And the reason they would come together on the first day of the week was to partake of the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 11 makes that same point. The reason the Corinthians met on the first day of the week, as 1 Corinthians 16 shows, was supposed to be to partake of the Lord's Supper. Paul said it wasn't to partake of the Lord's Supper because it wasn't the Lord's Supper they were partaking of. They had so desecrated it, but it was supposed to be. So both of those passages tell us that the reason for the first day of the week assembly was to take the first day of the week Lord's Supper, and then they go together. The Lord's Supper and the Lord's Day have the same word connecting them. The word Lord's in Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 11, and Lord's Day, Revelation 1:10, I think, is an unusual word. It's not the word Lord apostrophe S, as we use possessive, but it was an adjective that means a day connected to the Lord, or a supper connected to the Lord. Only 2 times in the Bible that it's used. And I think it's significant that it's used for the Lord's Supper and the Lord's Day. It has often been said by a lot of people who are smarter than I am that there ought not to be any Lord's Day without the Lord's Supper. And there ought not to be any Lord's Supper without the Lord's Day. They go together. The point is that Jesus was raised from the dead on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week. And that's the day upon which people partook of the Lord's Supper. Somebody asked Brother Furman Curley, who most of you know was a mentor and friend of mine, about the people in Rome. The Romans were looking for Christians to persecute them. And they learned that they could find them if they could locate where they were assembling on the first day of the week, because they knew they did that. And somebody asked Brother Curley, said, well, why didn't they just fool them by meeting, say, on Thursday night instead of on the first day of the week, so they wouldn't know to look for them? And Brother Curley quickly mentioned because the Lord wasn't raised on Thursday night. And I think that's exactly right. That is, I believe, the connection. Lord's Supper, Lord's Day, day of Christ's resurrection, all relate to one another, and the Lord's Supper has a connection, therefore, with the Lord's Day. Not appropriate in a Monday afternoon wedding, although some are doing it that way. That completely removes its significance and purpose. And I think that ought to be held very sacred. It was counted sacred enough that Christians gave their lives to meet on the day everybody expected them to meet, because that was the day that Christ was raised from the dead. While Paul preached to them after he was there, and I don't know what time they got together. You can argue all day about whether they were using Jewish time or Roman time, and whether when they met, if they were using Jewish time, they met at what we would call Friday afternoon and continued over into, Saturday afternoon and continued over into the first day of the week, or whether they met late in the evening on the first day of the week according to Roman time. Whatever they did, here's what's known for sure from the Bible. It was still the first day of the week when they met to break bread. And they met on the first day of the week to break bread. So you can be sure that on the first day of the week, they broke bread. Now, I don't know, there are other things about that you have to work out for yourself, and there's no positive evidence to settle some of those questions. But the question that doesn't have to be settled is, it was the first day of the week when they met. It was the first day of the week when they broke bread. And that was significant because that's the day the Lord was raised, and that's when the breaking of the bread, the Lord's Supper, is supposed to take place. Paul continued his preach till midnight. There were lamps in the upper room where they were gathered. A young man by the name of Eutychus was sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer, and being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long time until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted. I presume that's a case of Paul raising somebody from the dead. Some think that he just wasn't actually dead, Paul just healed him. But it looks to me like the point is that he fell and died as a result of his fall, and Paul healed him. Somebody has pointed out, and I've already mentioned, that Luke seems to be interested in paralleling the things Peter did in the first part of the book of Acts and the things that Paul did in the second part of the book of Acts. And one of them is, if this is a raising the dead, that both of them raised the dead. It does, if you look at it carefully, trace out the different things that Peter did, look at how Luke reports the things that Paul did, and you can line them up side by side and see that there is a very definite correlation. As, for example, when Peter's shadow healed some people, and a handkerchief from Paul healed some people. That kind of a parallel about several different things seems to be one of Luke's interests to show that Paul had the same kind of apostolic power that Peter did. And whether or not that was accidental, it is pretty obvious that there is a parallel between the things that Peter did and the things later that Paul did. So they were obviously comforted by the fact that he was raised from the dead. A lot of jokes have been made about preaching till midnight and preaching till people fell asleep and fell out the window. But in actuality, these people didn't have a lot of opportunity to meet like we do. We're blessed to live in a country that at one time at least believed that it was sufficiently Christian to make Sunday a day when you didn't have to work so that it's possible to gather together to worship. But they lived in a time when most of them were slaves, and Sunday was just a regular day as far as the rest of the people were concerned. So they met when they could. You go back to the Jerusalem church, and you can see pretty firmly they met daily. The Troas church obviously didn't meet from the time Paul got there until the first day of the week. But when they did meet, they met all night. And they were willing to take whatever time was necessary to honor the Lord in the Lord's Supper, and then also to grow as they studied Scripture together and heard gospel preaching. So there's no specific time set as to when all the times were that the church might meet for edification. It's different places, different times, according to people's circumstances. We're very fortunate to have the circumstances where most of us have Sunday off, and most of us have 8-hour days to work, and therefore we have time to do things like have a Wednesday night service and a Sunday morning and a Sunday night service. And while those specific times are not designated in Scripture, I would argue that we don't meet too often or spend too much time in joint study of the Scripture. If anything, it would seem to me that it would be too little, and maybe some additional time might be helpful. But I believe we certainly ought to take advantage of every opportunity we have, and be thankful for the fact that we have as many opportunities as we do. They went back to the ship, set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there. For so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. But when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Mytilene. That's right down here. No, different Mytilene. And sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios, and the next day we touched at Samos. All of those places are on the various maps. There's Mytilene, Assos, Ephesus is inland, Miletus is out on the seacoast, and that's, as we'll see in a minute, where he asked the elders to come out and meet him there so that he could talk to them. Yeah, here we are. Lost my place. Verse 16, Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. But he actually, as I said, was in a hurry. But now from Miletus, he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him, and when they came to him, he said to them. So that's a beginning point of a new issue. This is a lengthy discussion Paul had with the elders at Ephesus about his work while he was there. A good many things are said about preachers. There is material here in the first part of Paul's discussion telling what he did while he was at Ephesus that makes a very excellent talk to preachers about what preachers ought to be doing. And then Paul addresses the elders, telling the elders what they need to be doing, and there's a very excellent material there for a lengthy discussion about elders and what elders ought to be doing. And since one bell is rung, we'll take up this next Sunday, Lord willing, and begin with Paul's speech to the elders at Ephesus. In the meantime, any question or comment about what we covered today? We've got 3 or 4 minutes if you would like to, any additional information or tell us something that we didn't say. All right, thank you very much. We look forward to next Lord's Day.